And thank you for joining us on our US microbrew analysis. To give us a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today, we're going to start with the situation analysis of the microbrew industry. And then from there, we're going to talk about some of the data we had to analyze this industry and some of the cleaning methods we use to kind of analyze it. And then from there, we're going to talk about some of the questions that you posed to us with regards to some of our findings. And then from there, we're going to talk about what our overall findings were and what the implications could be for the Anheuser-Busch business. So looking at a top-level situation analysis, we're seeing that the microbrew industry accounts for about 13% of beer sold in the United States, which accounts for about $27 billion in net revenue. So obviously this is clear that Anheuser-Busch want to tap into this market a bit for potential growth. So that's why Clark and Lane Consulting were employed to review some of the market data to understand trends within this industry and how small microbrews are taking staking claim to the U.S. territory. And this is all kind of focused on the research question of how identifying potential growth opportunities that lie for potential exploration in the small beer category for Anheuser-Busch. So look at the data we have to work with. We combined two data sets, one which was beers data and the other were breweries data, both of which included some stats on some of the beer, about 2,400 beers in the United States, as well as location data of the breweries. Once merged, we reassigned some of the duplicate data so we have a more complete data set, and then we removed some of the NAs. The NAs included about 42% of beers which were missing the IBU numbers, and then about 3% of the beers which were missing the ABV numbers, and removing them was going to help us better analyze the trends within the types of beers that were sold. So once we merged the data and we did our cleaning, we were able to group our data by the number of breweries per state. And then from there, we saw that Colorado and California and Michigan were all the most populated states with breweries, at about each of which had over 30 breweries within the state. From the lower end of the spectrum, we're seeing that Washington, D.C., North Dakota, South Dakota, and West Virginia all were the least populated states for breweries, and all of which had about one brewery apiece. So they're definitely not a huge market for microbrews there, at least for owning breweries within those states. From there, we were able to calculate the median alcohol by volume and then group them by states. So from there, we found that Maine, Colorado, and Oklahoma had the most alcoholic beer within the breweries of the states, all of which had over 6% alcohol by volume. On the lower end of that spectrum, at about 4% alcohol by volume, we're seeing that Arkansas and Utah were the lowest median ABVs across all their beers. For Utah, this is actually not surprising because there's state regulations in place which limit the amount of alcohol that can be sold within beer. Looking at it from a bitterness standpoint, so for median IBU levels, we're seeing that Maine, West Virginia, and Florida were the most bitter beer states at about 60 IBUs from the median beers in the state. And then on the lower end of the spectrum, we're seeing that Arizona, Kansas, and Wisconsin were the least bitter beers based on the median IBU levels. Looking at the top most alcoholic beer that's sold within our data set, we're seeing that the Upslope Brewing Company's Belgian-style quadruple Ale at 12.8% alcohol by volume is the most alcoholic beer in the state. And in fact, at 12.8%, this would actually consider it to be a high-gravity beer. From a bitterness standpoint, we're seeing that the Astoria Brewing Company's Bitter Bitch Imperial IPA at about 138 IBUs is the most bitter beer within our data set. Looking further into our distribution of ABV data, we're seeing that the distribution is right skewed, meaning that there are more beers that have lower alcohol by volumes than there are beers with higher alcohol by volumes, so that there's actually less high gravity, what would be considered high gravity beers in our data set than non-high gravity beers. And this is based on a range of 12.5% alcohol by volume to about 2.7% that was available. Looking at the relationship of IBU and ABV, we're seeing there's actually a significant positive correlation between the two. And in fact, with every increase in percentage points of alcohol by volume, we're seeing that it is associated with a mean IBU increase of 0.0003%. in addition, we're looking at our scatter plot, we're seeing that that there's actually less instances in our data set where there are beers with less bitterness but higher alcohol by volume, which was interesting. So in conclusion, if Anheuser-Busch wants to open a series of bitter craft beers, marketing heavily in states like Maine, West Virginia, and Florida would be a good place to start. In addition, for a new high-gravity line of beers, strong potential markets for that beer would be Maine, Colorado, and Oklahoma. And then, as we talked about in the last slide, there's an extreme market deficiency for less bitter beers with higher alcohol content levels. So that could be a potential opportunity for Budweiser to open a new line of beers that's not necessarily served very heavily in that market. So that's our conclusion. Thank you again, and feel free to reach out if there are any questions. Thank you very much.